Okay, let's get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining Dragon Trail International and Venture Education for today's webinar, where we will be looking at the biggest trends in Chinese overseas education, as well as the top strategies for attracting Chinese students. My name is Sienna, and I'm Dragon Trail's Director of Marketing and Communications based in the UK. Joining me today from Beijing is Julian Fisher, co-founder of Venture Education, and William Ace Rolls, Director of Inbound and International Markets at Dragon Trail. So looking at today's agenda, Julian's going to get us started by taking us through a history of Chinese studying abroad and making connections about how this relates directly to the present and future of Chinese overseas education. Then we're going to take a quick look at current trends in the market in terms of overseas study destinations for Chinese students. And continue with advice and examples for what you can do to engage this market, which will include both B2C and B2B solutions, and also look at the significant crossover between the tourism and education industries and how these two industries can support each other. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session. Please do send in any questions that you have at any point during the webinar by using the Q&A button on your Zoom control panel, and then we will answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. One more thing I'd like to note is that we will be sending out today's presentation slides, as well as a link to a recording of the webinar to everyone either later today or tomorrow at the latest. So you will have all of the information from today's webinar for your own reference, as well as to share with any colleagues who you think might be interested but weren't able to attend the live session today. So just before we get into things, I wanted to give a quick introduction to Dragon Trail International for any of you who might not know us. We are a marketing solutions company with a lot of expertise in China, where we're headquartered. Our services include B2B and B2C digital marketing, virtual and hybrid events, market research and strategy consulting, and market representation services. In addition to extensive experience with the tourism industry, we've also worked with businesses in education, international trade, consumer goods, and MICE. And you can find more detailed information about the services we provide our clients and case studies of our work, as well as a huge collection of free resources on our website, www.dragontrail.com. So on that note, I would like to turn over to Julian to introduce a history of Chinese studying overseas and its significant relevance today.
I'm just going to briefly introduce Venture first. So if you can go to the next slide. We are a consultancy based in Beijing, and we support international education in China through research, events, and partnerships. Just a couple of things that we've done over the last month. We have co-organized the China School Awards for international schools across China. The other co-founder, Jubei, has a WeChat channel that speaks to thousands and thousands of parents who are interested in international education every month. We've supported big organizations with strategies around overseas admissions, and we have a network of thousands of teachers across China as well. So lots of access points to different parts of education in China. So without further ado, if we can go to the next slide, I have only got 20 minutes, and I'm going to try and cover the entire history of Chinese students studying overseas. Now, you might be thinking, why am I doing this? But I'm going to try to make it relevant to now. So if we can look at the next slide. We'll be looking at the history with each of the 9 key moments in history that I'm going to highlight. We'll also be thinking afterwards, why does that matter now? And really looking at some of the macro trends that have spread across the whole history of Chinese studying overseas, because I think if you can understand those, you'll understand a lot more about what you need to do to attract and engage Chinese students studying overseas. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I want to highlight is 2 of the first Chinese students who had some kind of engagement with the UK. So on the left, we have Shen Fuzong, and he was not a student in the UK. He was actually a Jesuit missionary But he did go to the University of Oxford and help them to catalogue the Chinese books in the library. So in some way, that's the first Chinese student that engaged with a UK university. But on the right, you have Dr. Wang Fun, who went to Edinburgh, and he is the first Chinese student to graduate from a European university in the middle of the 19th century with a degree in medicine before coming back to China and working in Macau. So the point here is that China has actually an incredibly long engagement with overseas learning. And I think that can get lost sometimes to those who think it's maybe only the last 30 years. Actually, it's hundreds and hundreds of years. And over that time, stereotypes have developed, and it's important to understand them. So I went to one of my Chinese colleagues in the office who's very, very knowledgeable about education, works a lot with parents and different schools around China. And I asked her, what does she think parents' general perception is of 5 different countries and territories? So if we can go to the next slide. Now, again, this is her impression of what she thinks parents think of different places. So USA, guns, bad relationship with China. US undergraduate is still the best. Australia, easy lifestyle, good for retirement. I don't think it's highly academic. UK, very rigid but respected. Undergraduate is very watery, apart from G5. Canada, immigration seems very possible. Europe, expensive, it's too niche, but you can get a green card. So I think it's interesting there to think about, how do you react to these stereotypes and different perspectives? Do you lean into them, or do you try to react against them and change the narrative? So our second piece of Chinese history, next slide, please. And apologies for speaking so fast, but I'm trying to get through this in less than 20 minutes. So this is an important moment at the end of the 19th century. This is when the Chinese government actually sent 120 children to study in the United States. And the average age was 12 years old. So this is a pretty amazing moment, actually. They were sent in 3 groups of 40. But I think something really interesting about this movement is why it happened. So the Qing government basically saw that the development of the rest of the world was outpacing China. They saw railroads, they saw electricity, photography, and they realized that these had been developed outside of China, not within China. They wanted to catch up. So this quote at the bottom, learning merits from the foreign to conquer the foreign, I think is really, really important, because in many ways, not much has changed up till now. And it's really important to understand that students studying overseas is still more about the national strategy of the government in China than it is about individuals pursuing, their own future. So if we can go to the next slide, I guess there's some good news here. And that is that still there is a lot of positive talk within national government here, within the Ministry of Education, about internationalization of education and continuing to encourage study abroad. It is still seen as something that is benefiting the country. I guess the kind of thing to be careful of, though, is that might not always be the case. So what would happen if that did turn? What would happen if actually national strategic interest turned against studying overseas? But as I said, right now, the good news is even up to Xi Jinping, the president of China, there's still positive talk about students who study overseas and what they can offer the country. Okay, so the third point in Chinese history or Chinese students studying abroad. Can I have the next slide? So Sun Yat-sen, really, really important figure in China, kind of the father of modern China. He's the person who helped overthrow the Qing dynasty in 1911 and kind of set up a new Republican government, and was the first president of the Republican government. Now, what's really interesting from our perspective for this presentation is he also studied overseas. He went to Hawaii when he had no English at all, ended up winning lots of English competitions because he learned it so quickly. He was there for 5 years. Now, what's important about that is the reason that he left was not because he wasn't having a good experience. It wasn't because he wasn't learning a lot, that he wasn't engaging with his education. It was actually that his family, particularly his brothers, were worried that he was embracing Christianity and the impact that that might have on him. So this I think, highlights another continuing trend, which is that safety and the perception of safety in various forms is still paramount to Chinese families when their children are studying overseas. So if we can see the next slide, in a recent survey about studying overseas, for one of the first times, safety actually topped academic level of the school in terms of what is important to you when studying overseas. And And I think it's really interesting to understand that safety is defined and determined in a lot of different ways. So obviously there's personal safety. COVID and travel are a big thing right now, but it's also down to things like shootings and major security events and political relations. But the one that I think has come up recently for us, we've been doing a big research report for an international client, was why do Chinese students use agents? And one of the pieces of research we've been developing has shown that actually this one at the bottom left, fraud, is really, really important, because when you use an agent, you can hold them accountable for any loss or any challenges that you face in the process. But when you do things independently, you can suffer fraud from false payments overseas, fake rental contracts, banking challenges, travel fraud. So this is really, really interesting to kind of consider if you are an overseas education organization, like a school or a university or a local government looking to attract Chinese students, that safety is absolutely paramount, and it comes in many forms. And it's really important that you consider how you kind of respond to these, but also how you talk about responding to them as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the era of uncertainty. So in 1905, the Empress of China, she abolished the imperial examinations. Now, these examinations had existed for thousands and thousands of years. You could argue that they still exist in some form in the Gaokao, but what that meant at this time is that they had to abolish certain schools. They had to encourage new schools to develop. Suddenly, they had to encourage new scholarships. There was a real fervor from learning abroad. And this was an era when it wasn't just the government setting up scholarships to send people abroad. It was also private families were raising money from across their family to send their young people overseas. And I think that this is really important right now, because the reason they were doing that was not just because they wanted their kids to get an education. It wasn't necessarily that they saw that they could learn information that could be used back in China, but it was that in a time of uncertainty in China, countries overseas were seen as more stable. And that was really, really important to opportunity, but also just to the potential future of the family and the success of the family. So if we can see how that resonates now with the next slide, there are three things I think that a lot of families are thinking about right now in China. I mean, obviously there's a lot of domestic challenges, particularly around COVID. You had a lockdown recently in Shanghai, the inability to travel. I think that still, Chinese families see that there are opportunities overseas. I think there's about 132 Chinese companies on the Forbes 500 list at the moment, more than America for the first time ever. Only one of those companies generates more than 50% of its income overseas. So there's still huge opportunity for Chinese companies and Chinese individuals going overseas to be successful. But I think this middle one, honestly, is quite important at the moment. You've seen something coming up on the Chinese internet called the run phenomenon. And this is the idea that, searches on Weibo, the kind of Chinese Twitter for kind of moving overseas, emigrating overseas, to have reached absolute highs over the last couple of months. And I think that study overseas is seen as some kind of gateway or vehicle, potentially for the child, but perhaps the family, to maybe, move overseas, or at least buy somewhere overseas, or at least consider setting up a kind of dual living situation with China and another country. So again, overseas study is not just about study, it's also about the family and kind of finding certainty and security. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to have to race through these now. So this slide, I think you might know some of these figures, you might not, but they're all very important in Chinese history. But ultimately, they studied all over the world. And while I said in the first instance that there are stereotypes that exist about certain countries, I think it's really important for us to reflect, if you're outside of China, about just how confusing overseas education might be, and also just how little information people might have. But I don't think that that's just a kind of Chinese phenomenon. If you can go to the next slide, outside of Tsinghua and Peking University, I think most people in the UK or Australia or anywhere around there know very little about Chinese universities. If I was to show you these four universities as a potential student from your country coming to look at a Chinese education, I don't think you could really tell me the difference, much as most Chinese families can't tell the difference between any universities outside of Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge. But in reality, if you can click through them, actually, Zhejiang University is ranked 3rd in China behind Tsinghua and Peking. So it's really, really top tier, but you really wouldn't know that unless you've done the research. So rankings really, really matter. Now, something else that I'd say is whenever I speak to overseas schools, this is K-12 schools internationally, I'll always say to them, so, what is it that you offer that is unique? And they say, oh, we have such a unique school. And I've spoken to hundreds of schools. And then I'll say to them, let me guess. Next slide, please. You have really great teachers. You have a historic, beautiful, well-equipped campus. You offer a full holistic education with great extracurricular activities that really focuses on the child. And at the end of it all of your students go off to great university destinations. So if this is how you're talking about your school or university, be aware that you're not alone, and that for the average Chinese family, parents and students, you are going to look like any other school or university around the world. So you really need to differentiate yourself and think about what is your kind of value prospect that is actually really, really unique. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Yes? Am I back? Okay, good. So just quickly, Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter and then his kind of, when he was president, they came up with this idea that engaging China was going to really, really help with future peace of the world. It was going to help kind of political systems to align. It was going to stop future conflicts. So they suggested a couple of hundred Chinese students came over in 1979. And in the end, in the first couple of years, they sent 3,000. And they also ended up in the end, over 10 years, sending 100,000. So really, really successful program, really, really positive, I think. But in 1989, obviously, Tiananmen happened. There was embargoes and huge political rift between the two countries. And America said to all Chinese students who were studying in America, you can stay here if you like. And that became a really political decision because suddenly all of the brightest and best Chinese students who'd gone to study in America were now moving into academia and science and technology in America instead of China. So next slide, please. It's really, really important for us to understand that right now, and really ever since this time, maybe going back to the Qing dynasty, study abroad is still political. China wants to be self-sufficient. It understands the economic impact of hundreds of thousands of students going overseas every year. And up until now, it is pretty unregulated as a space. But my question to all of you is, if it were to become regulated, that would affect the volume and flow of students, and how equipped and how ready would your country be or your institution be if the number of Chinese students went down to 0? I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think it's worth remembering that still politics comes first and that the flow of Chinese students overseas is controlled by the government. It's not controlled by individuals. 39 million passports were issued in 2019. This year, only 1 million. So the government can definitely restrict the flow of students if it wanted to. At the moment, it doesn't, but I think it's something to consider. And next slide, please. So number 7, successful returning Chinese. So this is a scientist who came back, Shi Yigong, in the 80s. Anyone who came back in the 80s or 90s from studying overseas generally was quite successful, especially if they worked in science or engineering, because they brought back technology and know-how that could be utilized in the development of Chinese. And most Chinese know that. So there is still this idea that going overseas and coming back can lead to some form of success. The reality, though, is changing. So if we can go to the next slide, what's actually happening is that a lot of students who are coming back are not, meeting the expectations in terms of income or jobs that they would like to. So, all I would say with this is if you have pathways to work, pathways to employment, if you're in an institution that can support employability, this is hugely important right now. Li Keqiang, the Chinese Prime Minister, said recently, 18.4% of students or young people between the age of 16 to 24 are going to be unemployed. About 10 million new graduates are about to come into the market. So you need to be able to show a pathway to employment, work experience, internships, all that kind of stuff. Without that, honestly, the experience could be could be quite meaningless, because if they come back and can't find a job, that's going to affect perceptions of overseas study. Next slide, please. So yeah, basically here, I'll keep it really, really simple. The middle class is growing, but for them, it's not just about education. Next slide. It's also about other factors, and these factors can be really, really diverse. It could be that studying overseas actually makes your status increase a little bit. It might make you a more likely candidate for marriage. It might be about family rivalry. It might be that you met somebody on an airplane and they happen to come from an overseas university, so you sent your child there. Or it might just be that your kid didn't get into a public university in China and you want to send them to an overseas university. So the idea it's just about the subjects and it's just about the education is certainly not true. Okay, and then I think we're on to the final one. And I hope that this has been clear. Can we go on to the next one? Is that overseas study is deeply embedded in modern Chinese thinking. Even the current president of China, his daughter went to Harvard. But the billion-dollar question, I guess, is will numbers keep increasing? And I can tell you categorically, I do not know the answer to that question. I mean, if you were to put a gun to my head, I feel like we might be about to see a surge over the next 5 years, especially because a lot of students have been waiting to go and study overseas. But I think maybe after that, we might be close to the apex in terms of numbers. But of course, I don't know. There's a lot of push factors, there's a lot of pull factors, and it's impossible to say what will come out on top. So the next slide, I think I've done my 20 minutes, which is good. And I'm sorry if I've spoken too quickly. But yeah, if you can go to the next slide, I think if you are a school or a university, or you are a local government or someone involved with students going overseas, you really need to be thinking about these 9 key questions. So the first, how do you lean into or differentiate yourself from national stereotypes? 2, how do you align with central government's national strategy? 3, what safety measures do you have in place and how do you talk about them? 4, what pathways do you have for work or immigration? 5, what is your unique value proposition? 6, how are you preparing for a dramatic shift in Chinese student numbers? And this could be either way, up or down. 7, how can you support students' employability overseas and at home in China? 8, do you tick boxes aside from education that matter to Chinese families? And 9, are there ways that you can connect with the history of Chinese students studying overseas? We are going to share, I think, the PPTs after this. So if you haven't had a chance to take notes on any of this, you can get the PPT afterwards. So as was said at the beginning, we are going to have Q&A. So if you've got questions, please put them in the box at the bottom. I would love to answer anything that you have, whether it's about the history of Chinese students studying overseas or just more broadly about some of the issues that I've raised or kind of big macro trends around this. And then just finally, before I log off, if we can go to the last slide, if you would like to learn more of this kind of stuff and really understand what's happening with young people in China, please go and follow us on LinkedIn now. We really share a lot of stuff there every day, stats, numbers, trends, and really want to keep you on top of young people in China. If you are a university that has education programs, teaching qualifications, certifications, especially distance learning, please get in touch with us. We have a great university subscription. And finally, if you have a big, bold idea of something that you would like to do in China and an equally big and bold budget, please come and talk to us, and we would love to help you grow and do what you want to do in China. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. It was a really fascinating talk, and I'm sure we would all like to hear you speak even more about the history and also the great lessons that you took from all of those points in history. So with that crucial background, I'd like to look at some of the recent trends in overseas study abroad destinations. So here you've got a lot of numbers. We won't go through them each one by one. Don't be overwhelmed by all the numbers. We will be sharing the slides, as Julian mentioned. But this is really just to look at 10 of the top destinations for Chinese studying abroad. The numbers that we've compiled here are the most recent ones that we can find generally from that country's Ministry or Department of Education. And what stands out here more than just the pure numbers is the fact that China is the #1 source market for international students in so many countries, including the US, Australia, UK, Japan, Germany, and New Zealand. And when we look at these kind of top countries as a whole, it's on average, Chinese students make up around 1/3 of all overseas students in those markets. So China's biggest private education company, New Oriental, ran a series of very large surveys looking at overseas education for 6 years running. And looking at the data from that, we can see rising popularity for the UK as a study abroad destination during this time, as well as declining popularity of the US at the same time. Now, the latter it's been impacted by the political relationship between the US and China, as well as things like safety factors that Julian mentioned. It's also been impacted by restrictions on student visas that are given to Chinese students in the US and the rise in visa rejections for Chinese studying in the US. So all of these things have helped to make the UK more and more popular, and we've seen increases of around 20% each year over the last couple of years of Chinese students applying to study as undergraduates in the United Kingdom. Hurun's study of high net worth Chinese also showed increasing interest in the UK as a study abroad destination, and at the same time, some decrease in interest in the US. But overall, when we look at these surveys comparing 2022 compared to 2021, we see that apart from the US, all of the countries on the list actually gained in popularity. So I think this is really good evidence of the popularity of studying overseas among wealthy Chinese. Now, looking at the current travel rules for Chinese students who want to go overseas to study, the rules now compared to the rules a year ago have changed drastically. Things are much easier now for Chinese students to be able to get visas, to be able to enter countries without quarantine and testing requirements. More and more countries accept Chinese vaccines. So this is all very good for Chinese students trying to go overseas at this point. One factor that is another thing that may have benefited the UK over the past couple of years since the pandemic started is that unlike other countries like the US, which shut down its consular services and wasn't issuing any student visas at all for about a year, actually, the UK was issuing student visas during the whole time, and it was also open for international students the whole time, unlike countries like Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, which shut down entirely for all international students from any country. But looking at the situation now, most countries are open for Chinese and other international students to enter. They are issuing visas. Even Australia and Japan have reopened in the past couple of months. And the only outlier at this point is New Zealand, which is still not issuing any new student visas until the end of July this year. So running through that information, and we also have this all on our website in more detail if you want to check it out. We'd like to talk about some of the things that you can do to engage the market and share a number of examples that cover both B2B and B2C, as well as looking at how the tourism and education markets can, or tourism and education industries can benefit each other. So I think many of you will already be quite aware of the overlaps between tourism and education, but I wanted to stress some of the ways that these two industries support each other and how intertwined they can be. So first, you have of course, the people who just want to visit a famous university like Harvard or Oxford when they're traveling overseas, but it also includes prospective student visits. And just to share a personal example, a couple of years ago, I gave a tour to a Chinese family who was traveling around the UK with their son. Now, he was only around 12 years old, but part of their trip was to go to different universities in the UK so that he could start to think about where he might want to study when he got older. And the previous year, they had done a similar trip going to the US and visiting colleges in the US when he was only around 11 years old. So then he could compare the universities in the US and the UK. I think they were planning an Australia trip as well. So this kind of prospective student travel is something that can be quite important. Then, of course, once students are enrolled, they obviously attract more visitors. And even with China's current travel restrictions, which are very strict, it's really not rare for me to see Chinese parents together with their children who are graduating university on graduation days here in the UK. The Copenhagen Tourism Board published a very interesting report in 2020, which you can access free online. And this was a survey of Chinese students studying in the UK. So it's a little bit pre-pandemic. But they found that 60% of those students received visitors from China while they were studying in the UK. And those visitors were pretty much evenly split between friends and family. The same survey also found that 96% of respondents said that they planned to travel outside of the UK to other European destinations as part of their time studying abroad. And when they asked people about their priorities for leisure spending, travel within the UK was actually ranked higher than travel outside of the UK. So you can see from that just how important students are as a tourism market unto themselves, especially these days when travel outside of China purely for tourism is so restricted. And then finally, after students have completed their course, they might later return to the country where they previously studied. And they're also really your ideal ambassadors for the destination and for the university when speaking to the Chinese market. And we can see that a number of tourism boards have very successfully engaged with previous students that studied in the destination by asking them to share their photos and stories and then incorporating that into their social media directed at the Chinese market. So because of all of these reasons, tourism and travel brands do engage directly with students. Especially last summer, with international air travel from China so constrained, many of the big aviation carriers started to promote special deals for students. And those might include things like free extra baggage or even discounted flights for accompanying parents. And of those air carriers, the airline that got the most attention on China's leading social media platforms, WeChat and Weibo, for student outreach was Cathay Pacific. They organized a live streaming that had representatives from British, Hong Kong, and US universities last summer, and that reached more than 18,000 viewers. Then a tourism board that has been doing really excellent outreach to local students for many years now is the Edinburgh Tourism Action Group. They organize events for incoming Chinese students at universities in Edinburgh. And from those events, they then create WeChat groups, which they use later to find student volunteers and drive engagement with their social media channels. A couple of years ago, they actually published a Chinese language guide to Edinburgh that was written by student volunteers. And we find that content that they publish that is aimed at or contributed by Edinburgh-based students is part of their really successful Chinese social media strategy, both on Weibo and on WeChat. Another recent case study that demonstrates the overlap between tourism and education is a social media campaign that Dragon Trail ran at the end of last year for Visit Scotland. And in addition to long-term tourism inspiration, one specific goal of this campaign was to encourage Chinese who are studying in the UK to spend their Christmas holidays traveling in Scotland. And the way the campaign worked is that users could either upload their own photos or they could use photos that were supplied by Visit Scotland to create personalized posters. And then by sharing these posters online and also getting their friends to share the posters online, they accumulated points. And with those points, they had a chance to win lots of really great prizes, one of which included a free trip to the Highlands. Now on WeChat, you can't actually do geo-targeting because in Europe because of local regulations. But on Weibo, we were able to do targeted ads for users who were based in the UK. And in addition to that, we also did a lot of organic promotion using super topic hashtags for Scottish universities. Now on Weibo, there is a special kind of hashtag called a super topic. And this kind of hashtag has a dedicated landing page where you can see all of the content that has that hashtag. And you can also see all of the people who follow that super topic. So this really creates a community of interest. Now, before we share some other examples of case studies that are more focused on the education market rather than tourism, I would like to talk a little bit about a new project that Dragon Trail has been doing for the past month or so. And this is WeChat and Weibo rankings for overseas universities. As I mentioned before, WeChat and Weibo are the top 2 social media platforms in China. So going back to 2017, Dragon Trail started to collect weekly data on WeChat accounts for overseas tourism boards, airlines, cruise lines, attractions, and hotels, and publishing the weekly data for that, as well as quarterly and annual reports that kind of analyze the bigger trends. And then in 2019, we started doing similar rankings for Weibo. Now, starting at the end of May, we're now doing WeChat and Weibo rankings for overseas universities. And the WeChat rankings are ranked by the number of views that all of the content receives, and Weibo rankings are ranked by the number of engagements. So that includes likes, reposts, and replies. So currently, over the past 4 weeks, and our 5th week of data will come out tomorrow, we've been tracking 51 Weibo accounts and 33 WeChat accounts for overseas universities. And the way we put together those lists is we used the QS World University Rankings for 2022. We looked at the top 100 universities outside of China and then checked to see if they had Weibo and or WeChat accounts. So if you're interested to see if your university is already being tracked, or if your university does have Weibo and WeChat accounts that we might not be tracking yet, but you would like to add it to the list, please do contact us directly, and we would be very happy to do that to create a more complete list. So this is just the beginning, but looking at the first 4 weeks of data, here is the rankings for WeChat. We can see that it is very geographically diverse. The top 20 universities include those in Hong Kong, the UK, Singapore, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the US. But I would point out that the UK is very heavily represented, and there's actually only one US university, Duke University, ranked in 20th place. Now, looking at the Weibo rankings, again, they're quite geographically diverse, although we do have a US university, Yale, in 2nd place. And other countries on the list are the UK, Hong Kong, Australia, Sweden, and Germany. So although it's still quite early, with only 4 weeks of data, we can start to see some of the things that work quite well on WeChat and Weibo from overseas universities. Now on Weibo, we see use of Weibo super topics, which I mentioned earlier. That seems to work very well. It's working very well for Glasgow University, as well as giveaways. Those always generate high levels of engagement on Weibo. Looking both on Weibo and WeChat, rankings are a very hot topic, whether that's the QS World Rankings or the Times rankings. We see a lot of content around that. There's also been a lot of content around the Gaokao, which is China's university entrance exam. It happens in June, so obviously this is a very seasonal thing, but it's a trend that has stood out. So we will be continuing to publish weekly rankings. We'll have a new one probably out tomorrow. And we will also share information about those on our social media accounts on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. So you can follow us there for more information. And then we will be planning to publish our first quarterly report in October, which will look and analyze at the bigger trends that we see over a period of 3 months or 4 months. So thank you very much. And I'd now like to hand over to William to look at a few more case studies.
Thanks, Sienna. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. So if we change over to the next slide. So as we have both tourism and education attendees here today, I thought we could showcase a couple of both B2B and B2C examples of how these two industries can be combined. Research from the Leiden Asia Center has shown that Chinese students' main motivations for studying abroad is to expand their horizons and experience new things. And I don't think ultimately COVID has changed that. So it seems natural to consider education promotion as a form of destination marketing. For one example here that I brought up is we worked with the Tourism Authority of Thailand and the Thai Royal Consulate. We've been running a series of webinars this year for them. Obviously, webinars are a great way to gather a variety of resources to talk straight to your target audience. Their event, the speakers included local Thai universities, KOLs who focus on promoting overseas study as a whole, as well as bringing in travel partners such as Sichuan Airlines, and they were sort of discussing student-friendly routes. So they actually utilized our CTA Live platform that many of you might be familiar. That's WeChat-based webinar platform, which allows for in-webinar activity such as polling and live chat. On to the next slide, please. Similarly, we partnered together with the education department with the Philippines Department of Tourism. They enlisted us to help creating a dedicated website to act as their official educational portal for Chinese students, sort of gathering all their key resources from the various universities that host Chinese students, basically in an easy, accessible place, kind of creating their first digital footprint in China. On to the next slide, please. Now, with a lot of Chinese students or families still restricted to travel, the need for interactions through virtual events has persisted, really. We recently worked with the University of Karachi to hold a hybrid event honoring their Mandarin learning students with a virtual graduation. This was in partnership with Visit Beijing. We actually created an online quiz-based competition to learn more about Beijing as a destination. The students were invited to a hybrid award ceremony held on the campus in Karachi, and there was also an offline event in Beijing with city officials and local media. Dragon Trail provided all the tech solutions, the offline event management, and the after-event PR. Some of the sort of quirky add-ons that we created for this sort of graduation, hybrid graduation, was including graduation photos, digital trophies and awards going across the screen from Beijing over to Karachi, to basically sort of make people feel a little bit more like they were there together in the real time. The event utilized our event platform and was broadcast live for students, the faculty, and family could also join in. I guess as we look ahead to another academic year in which parents, and in some cases students, might not be able to make graduation ceremonies or award ceremonies, this should be a consideration for any faculties with high percentages of Chinese students to do some form of virtual award ceremony. But making the streaming easy and accessible for Chinese parents is key. Obviously, many standard virtual event platforms failed to address China's firewall issues, as well as catering for mobile and WeChat-based setup. You know, everyone's a lot more mobile, especially for the parents' age and the grandparents' age. They're wanting an easy access to be able to see their kids in their graduation or their award ceremonies. So this is where I feel that our Dragon Trails platform can really satisfy. On to the next slide, please. And finally, I'd also like to share a case that we did for the New Zealand Education Department. They actually delivered their annual China-New Zealand Education Week on our virtual event platform to showcase its tertiary, vocational, and early childhood industries to Chinese education agents and industry professionals. So it was a B2B event, but it could similarly be, you know, done for consumer-based if you were looking at trying to recruit students. This was actually a 5-day forum with a conference and networking sessions, coupled with a trade show element, organizing one-on-one appointments with 45 New Zealand education institutions and Chinese education agents. Obviously, Julia mentioned the importance of agents, and that's, you know, going to continue while study abroad continues to grow in China. I mean, across the 5 days, there were more than 1,200 attendees and over 350 one-to-one meetings were held. And obviously, the main purpose of this forum was to engage Chinese education agents to promote and sell New Zealand as an overseas study destination for clients and create business connections both sides. This, of course, done at a fraction of the cost for a traditional offline event. Obviously, they had topics such as vocational education and early childhood in the conference. So this kind of helped them position New Zealand as an education expert in those particular fields, leaving the foundation for business advancement opportunities. Furthermore, the extensive data collection allowed New Zealand institution to facilitate long-term business developments and partnership opportunities created by this event. And obviously, for now, global events, including, you know, if you're involving China, they will continue to need to be digital. Even as we progress to a more normal global world, the considerations of digital or hybrid models for student recruitment should be discussed when looking at budgets, audience reach, and accessibility. So as we look to the new academic year in September, please feel free to reach out to Dragon Trail. We'd be happy to discuss any ways in which we can assist, be it accessing our virtual event platforms and B2B tools, or working with us on social media or consumer-facing campaigns, websites, etc. Making sure that you're hitting, you know, the right mark with your target audience. Sienna, I'll hand over to you now. I'm sort of finished up. I'm sure some other audience may have some Q&A for Julia and yourself and me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, William. So just before we move on to Q&A, as I said earlier, we will be sharing today's presentation slides with everyone, as well as a link to a recording of the webinar. But you can also find more information about travel rules for Chinese students studying abroad, more information about some of the campaigns and case studies that we talked about today, as well as the weekly WeChat and Weibo rankings for overseas universities on Dragon Trail's website. Those are all in the resources section of our website. And of course, you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for regular updates on what is going on in the world of Chinese travel, overseas education, and digital marketing. So on that note, this will be in the slides that we share with you, our contact information, as well as Julian's contact information. So please do get in touch. And especially if you are from a university and you think that you might not be included yet on the WeChat and Weibo rankings, but you do have WeChat or Weibo accounts, please do send them to us, because we would love to have a more complete list. So I will stop